Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 85 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. We go live each and every week where we have the hardest talk about the hardest form of money, and we cover everything that happened this week in Bitcoin in part 1, this week in macro in part 2, and this week in geopolitics part 3. And we tie it all together with this transition to this world that we're going to of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies. How to protect yourself before CBDCs take away your freedom and AI takes away your job, and how to own Bitcoin as a peaceful resistance using proof of work. So we're going to be going through several things today. The main topic and the main theme is it has been an absolutely wild week again, and that is the norm. Each week, it is accelerating faster and faster, and the news flow is getting more and more chaotic. So this week, we're going to be covering about Bitcoin stability in part 1 and the news this week. The US Destabilization Campaign. And we are right now in the middle of a Israel attack on Iran and a regime change operation. We're going to be covering all of that. And we're going to be following the money to make sure you see what they're not telling you in the normal news. So in part 1, here this week in Bitcoin, we'll be covering Bitcoin strategic reserves, updates on stablecoins and Treasury companies. They are fast and furious. And then we'll be covering in part 2 the latest that we're seeing with the weakness in the dollar and the campaign around the Federal Reserve, big, beautiful bill, and everything that's happening with the civil unrest campaign starting in LA, how to read between the lines and how it connects to the macro picture. And in part 3, we're going to be going through the Israel strikes on Iran, what next, what you're not seeing, what they're not telling you, what I got right in previous broadcasts, what I got wrong. I'm going to make sure you're fully up to date so you can have an understanding of what comes next. So without further ado, let's jump into part 1 this week in Bitcoin. Okay, so we had an announcement from Brazil, and this is the first committee, and they approved the Bitcoin Reserve Bill. So this would allow Brazil to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. I covered last week that Russia launched and made an announcement that they're going to be doing structured product Bitcoin bonds, and they launched Bitcoin futures on the Moscow Stock Exchange. Those are now live on the Moscow Stock Exchange. And so if you think about BRICS, you've got the Brazil has approved their potential Bitcoin strategic reserves. The R has been utilizing Bitcoin across the BRICS network in order to clear large multinational and geolocation trading as well. The R has now been looking at Bitcoin strategic bonds, which are bit bonds, which may be a precursor to other countries. And then we look around at the other countries next. So what will I strategy India be? C strategy China. These are two people that have flip-flopped back and forth. But my guess is that China would be the one that would be buying those Bitcoin structured project bonds moving forward. And of course, South Africa, we covered that as well, what's happening there. Meanwhile, during the midst of the war zone, Ukraine draft a new law that would introduce a digital assets like Bitcoin into a national reserve. Not quite sure how that would work and didn't read the full thing. Normally, strategic reserves come, like some people are using it through confiscation of Bitcoin. That might be the plan. Or there are countries that have resources, but Ukraine is completely vassalized now to BlackRock, which has been funding all of the war as well. And it looks like there is no de-escalation there. So how would it use Bitcoin strategic reserves during a time of coming out of debt? We shall see. It looks more likely to be looking at the bit bond side as well. Meanwhile, in South Korea, the new president that we talked about last week, Lee, who was a Bitcoin-friendly new president, he's now already introduced legislation this week to allow banks to adopt Bitcoin and crypto. And at the same time, South Korea unveils a plan to allow crypto stablecoins. So it's all about stablecoins, reserves, and obviously they're getting their banks to be able to own Bitcoin as well. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent in US, he came out with some statements around there's been a big push around stablecoins. And he was mentioning what we've been talking about for a long time on Bitcoin Hard Talk, that stablecoins could essentially back, they could use treasuries to back these stablecoins and allow the US dollar to dominate. And so there are further progressions there. The US Senate, I talked about the GENIUS Act. This is what allows stablecoins to be legalized or progress and have a regulatory environment and the rules around stablecoins after the Circle IPO that launched last week. It passed via Congress, has now gone to US Senate, and they voted to advocate for the GENIUS Act and the crypto stablecoin bill, which potentially will go to the next stage on Monday, whatever that may be. Meanwhile, look, we're getting to see loads and loads of stablecoins. That's obviously the strategic focus, especially with what we've been covering on Bitcoin Hard Talk in the macro sections, and the ability to try and do some creative financial engineering by backing stablecoins, by treasuries, and circumventing monetary policy at the Fed as it's becoming not so effective relative to the current situation of the US government, where people are getting more skeptical about lending to the US government on those 10 to 30 years. There were more auctions for that, so we'll cover more about that in the macro section. But at the same time, as I said, we are swimming with sharks. Remember, Bitcoin proof of work was designed where it doesn't matter who owns it, but you want to own it in self-custody in order to harness the freedom and protect yourself and peacefully boycott the Federal Reserve and the proof of weapons network that funds all this war and violence, death and destruction. Speaking of war, violence, death and destruction, the banksters from the European side as well. In fact, the $1.5 trillion Deutsche Bank infamously has massive exposure to a short silvers trade that we don't know whether that's actually resolves itself. But it announced that it is considering issuing its own stablecoin. So all of these banksters are now looking at issuing their own stablecoin. Now, stablecoin is a version of full reserve banking. Full reserve banking means that it significantly undermines their fractional reserve banking model. It also adds transparency, and it also adds a different layer of knowing what is backing that. So how the banks are going to be managing these two different models, where they want to make sure that you don't take your stablecoin out of the bank, which is how stablecoins work right now. This really does radically change the financial system, hence why the GENIUS Act and the Fed and various other OCC, currency controllers, are going to want to be involved in these different things. But we got a flurry of announcements around these stablecoins now. For those not familiar, a stablecoin is just simply a way of sending a digital dollar, as easy as sending an email, as easy as sending a Bitcoin transaction, where all you need is a wallet address. You can self-custody it, but because it's issued by a centralized issuer, they have to comply with Bank Secrecy Act and AML and KYC laws. So they could, in theory, seize or freeze your wallet or put it on an OFAC list. So it's not like, Bitcoin. However, it is a innocent until proven guilty way of sending a transaction if you can take it outside of the centralized platform. Whereas with a bank, it's a guilty until proven innocent system, where if you're doing a larger transaction, you have to provide everything before the bank allows you to do the transaction. This allows you to send the transaction, and then if they wanted to freeze it or something like that, they'd have to go through a more complex process. So it's a radical change in how things are done, a significant improvement, but it's still not like Bitcoin, which is an actual asset where you can own your own money, spend your own money, and there's a fixed money supply. So it doesn't expand as debt increases in the debt-based Ponzi scheme. But stablecoins are good for spending when you limit your exposure, while Bitcoin is a great technology for saving historically over the long term. Not financial advice, can't promise the future, but I still believe it's the best technology in the world for saving and it's still the technology that I use as well. That's different from investing. Anyway, so we also had an announcement that Chainlink, which is an alternative type of thing. When you're in the stablecoin world, you can't help but look at what blockchains they are, and then you go further down the risk curve than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is completely different, but when you're building all these stable coins and various other assets, they tend to be done on different chains. Eventually, these things may come to Bitcoin Lightning Network, which is a layer 2 network, and that is starting to get more and more growth and traction. But for now, it's other blockchains that get used, and one of those is Chainlink, which has successfully facilitated Hong Kong and Australia central bank digital currencies. Yuck. So central bank digital currencies are like stable coins, but they're issued by the central bank. So if you can imagine, there is a competition for who is going to benefit from money creation. All fiat currency is created as a debt. If you do it within a bank creates a digital currency, which is a bank deposit every time they issue a loan. So if you take out a mortgage, they write that into existence. They create it out of thin air. It appears as a digital deposit in your bank account. You can then buy a house with that, and they get interest on that for as long as you got the mortgage. And that was new money created. It's like their digital currency within the bank's ecosystem. It comes with interest, which is why it's a debt-based Ponzi scheme, because all currency is created as debt, all fiat currency, and therefore, where is the money to pay the interest? We have to roll over the debt, which is why consumers, businesses, governments, central banks have this debt-based Ponzi scheme, particularly with the US dollar that sits out of the global network of currencies that are kind of like nodes on top of that. But anyway, between Hong Kong and Australia, there was a central bank digital currency exchange that is being launched using Chainlink to create these interoperabilities. And it's a pilot that was done with Visa, Legacy Transactions, Fidelity, Legacy Asset Manager, and China AMC as well. So the big players are starting to innovate around this. And remember, we're going to be moving to a world of central bank digital currencies or stable coins, which is why your job is to build as much Bitcoin as possible and only use those for your spending money because they can take away a lot of your freedom as they become programmable. So it's a race right now to earn as much fiat currency as you can, save it in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, and before we transition. It looks like America is going full-blown into a technocracy. I'll cover more of that in the macro section and how it relates to the American civil unrest campaigns that we're experiencing right now. And within Europe, later this year, by October, they're meant to be beta testing China, Australia, more and more central bank digital currencies to be beta tested. Keep an eye on these things. They are coming, and your job is to get as much fiat currency while you can before this starts integrating with artificial intelligence and we end up in this deep surveillance. You have to build your economic power by beating the system, boycotting the system by saving in Bitcoin, boycotting BlackRock and other asset managers that want to own your Bitcoin so that they can use it with other banks that want to leverage it by not borrowing from them, holding it in self-custody and spending local. And this is how we're going to be able to make sure that you exit the system, and we need as many people to be able to do that. We also had Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, we'll cover more in the macro section. Deep state actor for the military-industrial complex, ushering in genocide as a service, occupation as a service, beta tested in the Middle East, being involved in the technology drones that are beta tested in Ukraine right now, and just ushering in all sorts of crazy surveillance tech. He backed an ED, basically he backed a crypto firm that is going to be filing for basically a US IPO in order to go public. And what are they doing, all these companies? They're just going public to buy Bitcoin. It's the latest frenzy. We're seeing it all over the place. Rather than you owning your own Bitcoin, rather than a company going bust, as we transition to this world of artificial intelligence where business models are being disrupted, rather than taking these public companies, they are being reversed into Bitcoin treasury companies. And we have had the next wave of pumps and crazy valuations with these different types of companies. And I've covered this in previous episodes, more and more companies getting into this. I don't recommend being involved in any of these things. You've got the most beautiful asset, Bitcoin, and these public companies want to introduce counterparty risk into the middle, complications in the middle, with the desire that they want to be able to drive you higher returns than owning Bitcoin. But that trade hardly ever works out well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And an example of that is GameStop. So GameStop announced this week that is launching a convertible note offering of $1.75 billion. And with that $1.75 billion, they're going to be buying Bitcoin. And they also had in their business plan that they're going to be getting into automated trading cards. Now, GameStop is like a meme coin. It's now a Bitcoin treasury company. It's got this legacy business. It's got $5 billion of cash reserves. It's got a Bitcoin treasury, now automated, trading cards. Who knows what this thing is going to be? But the interesting thing is this time it didn't quite work the same as everything else. As soon as it was announced that it's going to be doing this $1.75 billion, when it's already got $5 billion, for some reason, GameStop corrected 25% after the announcement. So we're already starting to see some of the weird cracks in this model of turning these companies into Bitcoin. Now, what's interesting, though, is that if you build enough Bitcoin strategic reserves or treasuries within these corporations, again, I'm not saying whether you should be doing that, whether you should be investing in those things. Stick to Bitcoin, you'll be fine. Add all these layers of complexity, things can only go wrong. But the fact of the matter is that it is saving many of these zombie companies. In theory, it shouldn't trade at a discount. And if it does, you can imagine some of the predatory private equity houses just accumulating these companies, in order to take out the Bitcoin. So it adds somewhat of a price floor if it ever trades at a discount to that. But as I've always said in previous episodes, this is building up a systemic risk event that eventually could lead to cascading liquidations. And we've seen this time and time again within Bitcoin. And I just want to make sure you're not on the wrong side of that trade. If you hadn't watched, what we do each week is I break these videos up into 3. If you head over to my YouTube channel, Simon Dixon, there's 2 sections: the live, which is where all of these episodes are, and another section is the videos. You can get just the relevant section, and we title, and you can go a little bit deeper around making sure that you don't get caught on the wrong side of these things as well. There was also basically a company, I think it's called Shami Trading Holding or something like that decided to do this with Ethereum. And they announced that they're going to be doing Ethereum strategic reserves, and they've accumulated some Ethereum rather. And this went down 75% after the announcement of a private placement in order to buy Ethereum. So strange behaviors happening. Other ones, they went up like 15x, 25x. Again, stay away from the gambling. Bitcoin is a beautiful asset where it can allow you to avoid all of that gambling, own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. And everybody that has done that over a continual period of 4 years has beaten every single fund manager, hedge fund manager. You get to beat Wall Street. You get to beat all these people that want to come between you and your money. And very few people outperform it. In fact, it's incredibly rare as well. But the idea behind this is the banksters, investment banksters. I used to work in investment banking, whether it be on the market making side or the corporate finance side. I know how these people think. They are cashing in on all of these Bitcoin treasury companies and reforming these zombie companies and doing SPACs, reverse mergers, consolidations, all sorts of fee earning activities. Then they'll be doing leverage buyouts, Bitcoin backed lending. All of the TradFi sharks are getting in. And it doesn't matter if you stay outside that system, you can allow them to carry on because Bitcoin was built as proof of work, where you get to own your own money, spend your own money, and the monetary policy of Bitcoin layer 1 ain't going to change, despite what these crazy derivatives traders, banksters, and traders that will be manipulating the short-term price as well. One interesting one as well, for those of you that are old school, that know I've been doing this channel since about 2009 when Bitcoin first launched. And during the ICO phase, which was approximately I'm showing my age now, 8 years ago, the 2017 ICO phase, one of the real controversial ICOs is an initial coin offering where you launch a coin, you sell it to people that want to purchase that coin using Bitcoin or another type of token. And this was all the rage in 2017. It was kind of like the Bitcoin Treasury companies where everyone was launching a token. You couldn't get away with it. You couldn't get away from it. One of the 1 year ICOs, they did this whole ICO that was raising for a whole year based upon an algorithmic way of calculating the price you get. So I was talking about the 2017 EOS ICO, which was one of them. It raised about $4 billion or something. Don't quote me on all these numbers. Settled with the SEC for maybe about 27 million or something that is insignificant relative to what they actually raised. And they ended up with hundreds and thousands of Bitcoin. And then they launched the EOS network, but virtually no one used it. Interestingly, they ended up like trying to create this decentralized social media platform. I think the website was called like Voice or something. And Michael Saylor ended up trying to acquire that domain. And that's how he first heard about crypto before he got into Bitcoin as well. Well, anyway, these people that raised all this money, they didn't deliver upon their promise. Some would call them scammers, but they ended up with all of this Bitcoin within this company called Blockone. And now essentially it looks like they're going to make that company Blockone public as a Bitcoin treasury company. Now, what is interesting is they raised so much Bitcoin that they didn't end up doing anything with. They had this zombie company where they just didn't need to do anything but hold the Bitcoin. And that's the interesting trend that we're starting to see as well. So it looks like we've gone full circle where the company that kind of was very scammy to raise through this ICO that had to settle with the SEC that didn't do much, put it in the company, and now the company's going public, and now they're going to create a public Bitcoin treasury company on all the Bitcoin that they accumulated from everybody. So it looks like they will IPO, if memory serves me right, last time we did the research, and you can look at the wallet addresses, with about 164,000 Bitcoin that they ended up raising through this token sale, which would essentially make them the second largest public Bitcoin treasury company behind Strategy, which is headed towards 600,000 Bitcoin. And so, the irony of this whole thing is that you make a load of money out of Bitcoin by selling a token, you put it in a company, and now you're going to go public. And just by keeping that Bitcoin rather than doing anything, we're getting these very, very strange scenarios where maybe we're going to see more of that. But the latest trend is all of these companies going, going public anyway. What else did we see? We had a report came out by Coinbase that they said 60% of the Fortune 500 companies are now working on a crypto project as well. With that in mind, we started to get to the next phase of what I covered earlier, the Stablecoin Act, the GENIUS Act. We've now got the amended version. It exceeded 60 votes in the US Senate. And so apparently that means that it's going to be able to go through maybe next week. And that was, ahead of the Circle IPO, but we're obviously getting a little bit of a correction in the market due to the geopolitical section as well. Who else is getting involved and jumping on the bandwagon? Bank of America. Yes, the same Bank of America that used Palantir, Peter Thiel's surveillance technology, in order to launch a campaign to take down Julian Assange because he created WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks ended up being saved by accepting Bitcoin payments which allowed for this freedom of speech technology that was trying to be taken down by surveillance technology that was saved by freedom of speech money. And the deep state came after him, tried to put him down in prison for all sorts of things, including with the leader of UK right now, Keir Starmer. Now we've got Bank of America, who's coming full circle, and they're looking to launch they're developing their own crypto stablecoin. We also had announcements from Walmart. We also had announcements from Amazon that both of those are exploring issuing their own stablecoin. Also, Shopify. Shopify wants to partner with Coinbase and Stripe in order to issue a stablecoin. Now, what becomes interesting about this is that Stripe is a card payment merchant processor with APIs, which allows you to plug it into your technology. As we move to a world of AI agents are going to be able to program such applications, you can have it where they can accept card payments via an API via Stripe, and that can then be withdrawn as a stablecoin and exist in the digital era while you're having these different agents and AI agents trade with each other. But then you can go from stablecoin to Bitcoin, and you can put it onto a Bitcoin or stablecoin debit card, and you can completely bypass the bank altogether and live in a world without banks. Now, when the companies like Jack Dorsey's, I think his Strive, was it Strike? I'm getting confused there. Strive. So Vigit Ramesh. Yeah, anyway, getting confused with all the different ones. He was putting all of these different terminals where shopkeepers are able to accept payments. They'll be able to accept them on stable coins. That can be done on Bitcoin Lightning, various other things. And now we're entering into this bankless world as this progresses. Now, what happens when you can receive yield on that stable coin backed by treasuries issued by these technology companies? That's going to be the gateway drug into the system that they want to put you into. And this is progressing at a rapid pace as well. And there was one final announcement this week in Bitcoin, which actually is another leapfrog moment. If you are a geek like me, or you're ever involved, I used to have a US securities broker. We sold it to Coinbase. But if you're involved in US securities transactions, you'll know that most of the shares that you think you own, you don't own. You own them through your brokerage, whether it be E-Trade, Fidelity, whoever it is that you own it through, Interactive Brokers. And that broker is the register of those shares, and they maintain a database of who they owe those shares to when you log into your trading account. But the DTCC is the register of all of these shares, and it's mainly brokers that have access. So you add layers and layers of middle people between you and your shares. But now DTCC is considering issuing their own stablecoin as well. So when you have the share clearinghouse and register that is then getting into stablecoins, that is then getting into tokenizing these shares to integrate with these stablecoins, you can imagine all the disintermediation that's happening, taking out all of these middle people, and it's getting closer and closer to this chain, which is why they want to get these stable coins out. And that coincides with some of the things that we're going to be covering in the macro section. So that is everything that I think you need to know about that happened this week in Bitcoin that lays the foundation for what we're going to cover in part 2 and part 3. In part 2, we're going to do this week in macro. So if you enjoyed that, just before we move to part 2, in macro, we're going to be covering what the real story is, how the macro issues tie into many of the things that we're seeing in LA, the looting, the riots, the peaceful protesting, the destabilization campaign, the technology, how that relates to the big beautiful bill, what we're seeing in the trade wars, the latest in the trade wars, and the decreasing value of the dollar, and how that's all related to oil, gold, and how it all fits together. We're going to be covering all of that. What I would love for you to do is do me a quick favor. We are very close to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube right now. If you are not a subscriber, if you are watching this and you haven't subscribed, head over to YouTube if you're not watching it on YouTube already. Hit the bell symbol, hit all, on the subscribe button, and YouTube will notify you each week. Even if you were subscribed before, please go through that process again, because I believe we're going to be unshadow banned, and we have started to see the unshadow banning process. And once we hit 100K, we'll be able to get a review. Now, if during that review it turns out that YouTube does something funky, I've had this channel, since right before Bitcoin launched, and documented the whole journey from the very beginning, including the first Bitcoin conference. If it turns out that they're going to do something funky, make sure you follow me on Rumble. We will move over there, so have that as a backup. And in case that goes wrong, we'll also stream on X. So follow me over there, where I give real-time updates. And the backup of the backup of the backup is we've got our own environment on simondixon.com. If you join for a free membership at simondixon.com, you get my newsletter completely free, and I'll email you every week to make sure whatever happens, you get this information, plus digital copies of my free book, The Great Depression of the 2020 video series, various other goodies in order to help you transition to this world of Bitcoin, AI, and CBDCs. So do me a favor. Help the algorithm, help me get to 100K. We're very, very close. Subscribe. And if not, if you're already subscribed, share, repost, hit the like button, put a comment below. It will help the algorithm, and it will help us get to that review that we've been trying to get to. I'm going to take a little bit of a sip of water while you do that, and then we're going to jump into part 2, This Week in Macro. Okay, welcome back to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 85. This week, we're going to be covering This Week in Macro, and that involves the main focus on everything that's happening this week in macro, plus the escalation in what I call the US destabilization campaign. We've seen it in Europe. We've seen it in UK. It is now happening in the US, and I want you to be prepared, but I want you to follow the money and understand what is actually happening, because in the headlines, they're not going to tell you. So we're going to start with the main things that were happening this week in the macro environment, and then we'll get through to the US destabilization campaign, how to interpret it, how to protect yourself. And in part 3, we're going to be doing This Week in Geopolitics, which is all about what is happening right now as we record, a regime change operation with Israel doing strikes on Iran, what it means, what comes next, and what they're not telling you. Okay, so this week in macro, I guess we could start with, Trump's trying to make some announcements around US and China. It's going to take ages for these things to be resolved, but he's getting very keen to make an announcement. And so basically it was announced that US and China will hold trade talks in London. They had those talks this week. That didn't involve Trump and Xi Jinping themselves. It involved their relative representatives meeting within London. And there is ongoing conversations, and that will take a long time to figure out exactly what they're going to be doing there. But immediately Trump wanted to boast, and I'll read out what he says. We are getting a total of 55% tariffs, and China is getting 10%. But we are getting, what this essentially means when he says we are getting, so basically he's saying we're doing a deal, everything's great, we're winning, they're getting 10%, we're getting 55%. But what this actually means, we are getting, really means that we are paying. So if they got to pay, then that really means that this tax hike means that Chinese goods will be 55% more expensive for Americans who buy them. And remember, China doesn't need to buy American goods. America does need to buy Chinese goods because there are parts of that chain that can't be broken, which is what we saw. Now, if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I believe the tariff policy was a complete farce. It was a strategy done by BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network in order to redistribute the world into a multipolar world order. Just like COVID sends small to medium-sized companies within America, consolidate them up into the larger multinational corporations. Same with the export-driven as the second impact. So those companies can be vulture capitalized by the private sector that wants to acquire those distressed companies as a result of these tariffs and drive the world into this multipolar world order that BlackRock's invested in because it is invested in a global. And we're seeing more and more of that, what we call repatriation trade. which is where capital is exiting the dollar. It is then being converted into their local currency and then invested in their own local money market or stock market in order to boost and repatriate money out, which is in turn weakening the dollar and accentuating the effect as well. Now, as a result of what happened yesterday, and I was up all night giving commentary on this. If you follow me on X Spaces, I'll probably be returning to that because this campaign is live right now. But immediately when the escalation happened, where Israel started striking inside Iran, immediately that was met with oil going up 15% at its peak. It has come back down a bit, I think it will calm down. But Trump does not want the price of oil to go up, and so that starts to play into the dynamics of the geopolitical section and what comes next. Interestingly, in the strikes, I'll cover more of it in the geopolitical section, but there has so far been no strikes on oil infrastructure within Iran. And they did not want this to impact oil prices too highly. So the infrastructure at the time of this recording, I'm not sure if that has changed right now, but there have been no strikes upon oil infrastructure within Iran. Right. Now, remember the little bit of the farce. So we talked last week about the whole Musk thing, Epstein thing, Palantir thing, Trump thing. You can go watch that if you didn't watch it. But they officially went to the House in order to pass some of these Department of Government Efficiency DOGE cuts. And if you remember, I said the dollar is debt. America can't pay down its debt. If it pays down its debt, it triggers a depression, a deflationary cycle, a credit contraction, and therefore it will either have to have a monetary reform, because you can't fix that with a tax reform like tariffs, or it has to pivot away from that. And it looks like at the moment it is pivoting away because tariffs has already had the desired impact of splitting the world into the multinational world order. I'll cover more about that in the geopolitical section. And Doge needs to stimulate because the government needs to spend in order to get that GDP print. So then they can back all of this debt by stablecoins in order to roll over the Ponzi scheme further. It looks like they weren't able to achieve much of the cuts. In fact, it was so bad that they came in to get approval of slashing, wait for it, $9.3 billion from USAID, NPR, and PBS, which are the deep state operations, which fund much of the, things like funding militia groups and some of the things that gives America its soft power abroad that they seem to be cutting back upon, like USAID, all of the criminal activities with the black op money that happens by funneling money through to these operations. They only managed to get $9.3 billion. So those operations still continue and the money hasn't been saved. So as a result, what happened? Well, Trump is now raging a kind of destabilization campaign or a public argument on the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, in these debt spirals, they can only control the short-term interest rate. The market is controlling the 10 and 30-year bond rate, which is going up. It's corrected a little bit once the dollar has been having this volatility. But you should be watching the yield on the 10-year bond, the yield on the 30-year bond, and DXY, the value of the dollar as it decreases. Now, immediately, he's been coming out and looking for the Fed to do a 100-point basis point Fed interest rate cut. What this means is that is the short-term rate. It's not the long-term rate. The Fed can't control the long-term rate because the market doesn't believe what's happening as the credit rating is getting worse for America and has been downgraded. And so on the short-term rate, the Federal Reserve is able to do stuff, but the inflation numbers were improving. It was slightly worse, but it was almost as expected. So the CPI, Consumer Price Index, came out at approximately 2.4%. So that doesn't allow for an environment of cutting these interest rates. And so Trump is trying to accelerate that and demanding that it does a rate cut and add some rocket fuel to the market, which is translated as the exact opposite of everything he promised the American people. This is not rebuilding the manufacturing base. This is not doing the tariff trade. This is not, this is about getting back to Bidenomics and, quite frankly, what you have to do, because the dollar is a debt-based Ponzi scheme and you can't pay down the debt, which is why Elon ended up going off in frustration. Either it was a farce or he knew that, but, there's no way of doing that without creating the impact. So he wants some rocket fuel, which means wealth inequality. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Transfer of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street, the opposite of everything the campaign promised was due. And so there was a lot of rhetoric around Trump saying he's going to be announcing the next Fed chairperson very soon. And in order to have impact over the Federal Reserve, which is essentially a proxy for the banks, and the banks are way more in control of both the Federal Reserve and the government, because government are subordinate to corporate within America, UK, EU, and that hemisphere. He's kind of making this whole concept of what we're calling a shadow Fed chair, which is essentially what we had with Janet Yellen, where you have under Biden, where you have the Treasury Secretary that has a role within the Treasury side, which is the fiscal, the government. And then they move across to the Federal Reserve and they can enact the policy of Treasury for the Federal Reserve basically remove some of that independence, even though it's meant to be there. But we all know who's calling the shots. It's the banks that own the shares in the Federal Reserve. Anyway, we've got this concept of a shadow Fed chair because Trump hinted that he would look to appoint Scott Bessent as the Fed chair. Scott Bessent, which is the one that worked for George Soros when we were crashing the pound with the euro introduction, that essentially is a hedge fund raider that is now the Treasury Secretary that may end up becoming the Fed chair of the Federal Reserve in order to enact the policy. And you can bet you're better than dollar. What would be the strategy? Well, how about combining Treasury and Fed and ending up doing a stablecoin form of quantitative easing, where essentially the banksters or the stablecoin issuers, rather than the Treasury issuing that currency direct, they issue a stablecoin, back it by selling these new bonds, and then the stablecoin issuers receive all the yield from issuing stablecoin. Who are they? Trump himself, Howard Lutnick himself, all of the different stablecoin issuers that are essentially benefiting the worse the government debt gets with the higher yield by backing those stablecoins as we roll over the Ponzi scheme and you move towards it. And then what do? You issue it to everybody, combine it with Palantir or the social credit score, and now you've got your stablecoin quantitative easing with guaranteed adoption into a new technocratic programmable money controlled by the technocracies and those that are in the Trump administration for the loss during this transition. So remember, your job is to understand this, follow the money, and make sure that you're getting on the right side of it rather than being the one that they are bag holding to you, selling you all the shit treasury companies rather than owning Bitcoin. You are minimizing your stablecoin exposure and recognizing that much of this is to try and extract as much Bitcoin from you so that they can create a pump and dump and all sorts of market manipulation by the proof of weapons network as we transition to the final iteration of this debt-based Ponzi scheme that is designed to steal money from the average American person over to those that own assets. And what is the ultimate asset when you're transferring to this multipolar world order? Well, it is a neutral asset. What is a neutral asset? Gold, Bitcoin. One is digital, one is physical. And in the digital era, you want some Bitcoin, and you should, I believe, I can't give you financial advice, everybody should own more Bitcoin this month than previous month. Do what they are doing. Those that control the Federal Reserve, those that control Treasury, those that control the government, the BlackRocks, the Proof of Weapons Network, with BlackRock as CEO, that owns 20,000, has seats on 20,000 different companies and manages over $11 trillion. They're getting all their clients into Bitcoin, and they want you to own your Bitcoin through their ETF so they can control it. And their banks can end up using it in order to put it on their balance sheet so they can issue stable coins so that they can then back it by Bitcoin so that they can margin call and steal your Bitcoin, rather than eventually when the hedge funds manipulate it, rather than you just exiting the system and owning it in self-custody. And what are the central banks doing? The central banks are exiting the amount of dollar reserves that they have, and now the amount of gold that they're holding is going up and up and up. We're getting more and more of these bond auctions, and we'll keep watching these bond auctions as they're trying to roll over the $10 trillion of debt that the Trump administration needs to roll over. But now gold is going up in terms of central banks owning gold as a reserve, as some of them are selling down their dollar reserves. Others started to sell down some of their euro reserves, and now gold superseded the euro, even though it is strengthening relative to the dollar in this repatriation trade that we talked about. But now gold is the second largest reserve asset for central banks, and it has now passed the euro, which took the second place before. So they are doing what I'm saying. They are owning more Bitcoin, but through gold in central bank world, a hard asset that is not even as hard as Bitcoin, because gold has an average of a 2% increase in supply every year, whereas Bitcoin is under 2% right now, but it's a fixed supply of 21 million, and there's only another million left to mine. And there is more than enough demand from these treasury companies and various other people that are buying Bitcoin more and more. It is a race to accumulate the Bitcoin, hold the Bitcoin, and put it in self-custody so you don't get on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network that now wants your Bitcoin in these macro trades. So during this Iran strike, interestingly, we hit almost new all-time highs with Bitcoin this week. It went up to about 111,000 approximately, and then corrected down to 104K because Bitcoin is a leading indicator when markets are closed, and most of the escalation happens when most of the major market were closed. We had that oil 15%, it came back a little bit, but it gives you an indication, and we had some market corrections as well today as well. At the same time, based upon this, prior to the Israel-Iran strikes, we had the dollar, which DXY, which is the index of about 6 currencies priced in dollar. Now, there's two things when you're dealing with currencies. There is devaluation, which means your purchasing power, and the dollar has lost approximately 99%, if not more, of its purchasing power. That is different to relative strength, and that's what DXY measures. It measures the dollar, but priced in another currency. Now, what I encourage everybody to do to get the truth, whenever you're looking at a chart or pricing something, you should price it where the denominator is in Bitcoin or gold. And you will find all assets are losing. Real estate, bonds, stocks over the long term relative to gold and Bitcoin. You'll be very surprised about the performance. It takes out the illusion of pricing things in dollars, where things look like they're going up, but it was actually a strengthening dollar. Now, as the dollar is weakening, you have those that have foreign assets. Essentially, they're losing money on currency as they're losing money on assets, and so this is what causes them to want to sell their assets and end up selling their dollar assets so they can buy their own currency, so they can reinvest in their own. And so we've had the dollar below the $100 psychological mark, and it went below $98. This is a new record low after essentially a 14-year bull market when in the previous 14 years. Now, when the Iran strike and Israel strikes happened, we've had a bounce above. It came back a little bit, but it's still below, and it's just above the $98. Make sure you keep watching that. DXY is what you should be watching in order to see this repatriation trade of capital flowing out. Now, what is the proof of weapons network doing? So the proof of weapons network, I always call it, I've covered it. If you watch previous videos where I've said understanding the proof of weapons network, I described how it is this stateless entity that sits above government that is able to, in a more decentralized network, but with no accountability, control government, control all these different forces, and use various other things in order to manufacture portfolio management. Now, what do they benefit from? Such volatility in the dollar makes them a lot of money. So while getting all of these hedge fund trades, these venture capital trades, they're getting all the volatility trades as well. And so, volatility and the dollar weakening is they don't give a damn. They're going to make money out of that as well, the hedge funds as well. And so essentially, this is hyper accelerating the effect by using the derivatives market when the proof of weapons network, which knows and has technology and signals that it can put out there that all money managers are using, it will be engaging in essentially currency warfare at the same time, which is Scott Bessent's speciality and why he worked for people like George Soros and his funds. And essentially, because the proof of weapons network is global in nature, it can utilize any of these weaknesses in the currencies in order to get ahead of any of the investments when it's reallocating people's capital. And so they basically get to wage warfare against their own dollar, the host nation in US, where these companies are all public as well. And they get to profit off the dollar's fall at the same time as other divisions of the proof of weapons network, like say the Morgan Stanleys of the world, they get to basically sell and hedge for all of their clients as well. So they can either capitalize on the market swings as they choose, because they have no connection or tied to the dollar. That's not their game. Their game is simply to profit at all expense. And the government used to be able to represent their people, but now the government is subordinate because you can buy your politicians through lobby, through this proof of weapons network, where the government no longer represents the people anymore. So now you have these perverse structures where the proof of weapons network can control capital outflows as it pre-invests in the different regions. And you can look at the corporate, the companies, and you can see basically where next wars will be by reading the types of contracts that the proof of weapons network is getting, which is kind of what's been leading to a lot of my analysis as I've been sharing it as well. Basically, the dollar stability is somebody else's problem, but whose problem is it when the government and the Fed are subordinate to the same banks and financial institutions? The banks are the shareholders in the Fed that have the lobby money in order to lobby the government, and therefore they can have fiscal and monetary policy and they can engineer the game, and they are way more powerful because they have $10 trillion of the government's debt, the private banks, and then you've got the central bank as well. And so those that are the beneficiary of the debt, those that are underneath it are subordinate to it, which is why you have this proof of weapons network where essentially there is strategic campaigns to work against the American people, against the European people, against the British people, in order to maximize profits while governments deliver those agendas. And where is this? What do you do at the end of it? That's where stablecoins come in. They do two things. One, they allow you to roll over the debt so that the government never repays the debt, as Doge apparently tried to do. Probably just a data play into Palantir in this technology. But at the same time, you get the programmable money and you transfer the profits from issuing the dollar over to the technology companies that get to roll over the Ponzi scheme as well. While companies like Morgan Stanley, they essentially get to push all of their clients into pivoting their investments. And so that's why I follow many of these types of managed funds and the types of disclosures you can get around where that money is moving. That tells you way more than listening to what politicians tell you, or listening to media as well. Rather than just scrambling to hedge all of these things, they can get ahead of it, and they can shift capital to Europe, for example. And so we saw the euro increase relative to the dollar, but Europe is in distress because it's gone through a destabilization campaign. The Russian war and the escalation in Ukraine was about vassalizing all of the land into BlackRock that was issuing the loans, using nodes like Keir Starmer in the UK in order to collateralize the debt, using the UK economy so it can no longer invest in doing what governments are meant to do. And then you can push the narrative in order to extend the war rather than focus on negotiating peace. And therefore, you can then use this in order to squeeze more currency as the dollar weakens over to euros. And then you can use that in order to basically squeeze out pension funds so that pensioners get the short end of the tail. They get to outperform it for profit. And then BlackRock can then do distress loans on many of these distressed companies. This is why the destabilization campaign exists. You can get these predatory. Why? Because these are public companies that need to meet quarterly returns, and therefore they focus on short-term profits. And now the government is subordinate to them. The governments no longer work for the people, which is why you're getting much of this civil unrest. But an example of that, you saw that this week on the micro side rather than just the macro, where essentially water in the UK through companies like Thames Water has been privatized, and now it's privatized. You can then use this exact same structure of strengthening the pound, borrowing against that while you're executing this, and then you can strategically use those derivatives to weaken assets and purchase them in distress, and then you can push out those assets and not focus on the quality of the water, for example. And this is a classic example of how privatization leads to these perverse structures where you end up with water not being optimized for how it's meant to represent the people. And you can profit from this, and you can basically get distressed assets and strip out those assets by basically launching destabilization campaigns on the governments that you control. And that is exactly what we're seeing. So I know that you are led to believe that the Trump administration right now is doing mass deportations. Let me, aside from Republican, Democrat, communism, capitalism, left, right, the emotion of what you're told everything is that most people focus on, step outside. And in the last section of this, I just want to help you understand how the proof of weapons network, which is fiat currency, and at the moment, the largest money manager, BlackRock, is essentially what I call the CEO of the proof of weapons network, can utilize government policy, privatizations, and end up with this wealth redistribution that creates more and more civil unrest campaigns. And we're starting to see this in full force. So whenever I see something on TV, I don't listen to the media. I don't listen to what the politicians are saying. I try to follow the money and understand the commercials behind it so that I can understand why is this happening when most people can't figure it out. Okay, I believe that right now, Los Angeles is on the front line of a destabilization campaign, just like we saw in UK and we saw in Europe, and we saw that many times. The end result in UK was that there was mass arrests, people were shut down from protesting, and their phones were confiscated. And you ended up with this mass surveillance state from everybody staying at home, trying to avoid the violence and begging the government to control it by ushering in a next wave of command and control technology ready for the transition to stablecoins and central bank digital currency. So here's the playbook as I see it. And again, I'm just following the monetary trends. You decide whether you think this is feasible. But I don't believe that what you're seeing in LA right now was about illegal immigration. Now, there are some people that genuinely join protests. There are others that engage in looting. And then there are others that are deliberately, systematically paid in order to be agents of chaos. And then you subdivert and you film those people, and you end up with these crazy images of a Mexican guy with a mask on, waving the Mexican flag on a cross that looks like a Hollywood movie, in order to manufacture outrage, spread it across social media. Anybody that's still watching legacy media, they get to watch it, and you just get outrage and outrage and outrage until you end up begging for law changes, just like we saw after 9/11 with Patriot Act, that type of thing. It is an operation that is funded, and I believe, by constituents of the Proof of Weapons Network. The War on Terror was a classic example. An operation by the deep state, by CIA, which is controlled by military that sits, and government sits underneath. Remember my layer 3 structure. I said you've got the central bank and the asset managers. Then underneath that, you have the intelligence agencies, which is for representing corporate interest and some country interest. And then underneath, you have governments that represent corporate interest through lobby and monetary transactions. Then underneath that, you have the people. And so you can manufacture a war on terror by essentially engaging in an operation like an inside job to take down 9/11, manufacture a narrative like we need to have weapons of mass destruction, and then the military side of the operation can earn a load of money and trillions of dollars. You print the money, you pay for the inflation, and they're asset managing these operations that then leads to confiscation of gold in Iraq, for example, or confiscation of oil in Syria, for example, and various other things that is done through USAID and some of these covert and overt wars that I've covered in the past. The best book to understand this is read Operation Gladio by Paul Williams, if you want to understand how this structure was set up and the concept of this. But anyway, you can create these war on terror types of narratives. It is essentially a test zone by the Proof of Weapons Network for the latest narrative. And this is Trump. This is a multi-uni-party, everyone thinks is bipartisan. It doesn't matter who's in charge. The mission still continues. It's basically a model of violence that is basically monetized. So there is a business model behind the violence. It is algorithmically triggered. So you get data from the technology in order to use this technology in order to determine how to manufacture these types of campaigns. And it is basically regionally scaled. So you can just then repeat, wash, rinse, and repeat. And if it gets bad enough in one region, you can trigger being able to use the media in order to get a wider civil unrest campaign in order to meet a wider strategic goal. As I said, UK and EU were the beta tests. We saw this, for example, Mossad and CIA, and MI6, they implemented paying agents like Tommy Robinson connected to Israel, created hate campaigns that led to civil unrest and an uprising from people that are being subjected to these atrocity propaganda. We see it time and time again. Once you know the pattern, you'll recognize it, these Operation Gladio types of things. Now, this is multi-party, as I said. This is not just something that's happening right now. This is something that is built up over time. The Biden administration was essentially used in order to give you open borders. That was the open border phase. That leads to a narrative that was used by the Trump administration. And the Trump administration, and again, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, these people do not care. And I'm not talking about government. I'm talking about the proof of weapons network. They do not care about humans. They do not care about your well-off. And the government is subordinate to them. So you can't trust politicians because they need their money, which is how it works. But the Trump administration is now being used essentially to deliver mass deportations. That was the campaign. We've got the invaders, we've got the criminals, and whether there's truth to the narrative or not, you've got manufacturing fear and civil unrest so that when the deportations happen, you can have essentially what they always used to do when they would regime change a country like Venezuela or Syria or Libya or the other 100 campaigns in El Salvador or Honduras or South Africa or Sudan or Somalia, the ones that America has done time and time again for the military-industrial complex. There's a book called Covert Regime Change, if you want to learn more about this, where you can see just operation after operation, and it's still happening to this day. Well, what they used to do is they would take protests and then they would install agents into those protests, and they would use those agents to, quite frankly, just shoot in the middle of a protest, kill people, and then that would create the rage that's needed to turn a normal protest into violence, and then they could use that in order to regime change and overthrow a government. I believe that there is a campaign right now happening as we speak in Iran that I'm going to cover in the geopolitical section. But Trump is the mass deportation phase. And so once you combine those narratives together, you start getting people to get more nationalistic, to get more racially, when people are on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network, they're crippled in debt. They did everything they were told. They had operations like COVID that got them injected. They ended up with lockdowns, mentally ill, mentally distressed. We got people that are record suicide rates, record mental disorders, record drug addictions, the lowest birth rates because people have got addictions galore. Once you're in that state and you're not getting a job, and then you see a narrative around foreigners come in, an invasion, you're going to get mad. And that is the type of campaign that you're seeing. And then you get those that came in that will start protesting, join those protests, and then you can create the types of things. Now, both of these have their own profit model. And those models are essentially using government in order to basically, the government gets fake GDP. By fake GDP, you get to print money at the Federal Reserve level. You get to have something like the One Big Beautiful Bill. You get to use campaigns to scare people into approving those. You put all sorts of things in there, and then you get a bunch of money which costs the average American that doesn't have assets inflation. And then that money is siphoned off to the corporate contractors that get subsidies from government, and the corporate contractors get all of the money, and then they get to reinvest those in assets. And when you reinvest those in assets, you beat everybody that's in inflation, and you have this rich-poor divide that brews up into civil unrest when you have all the assets over a long-term period controlled by fewer and fewer people. And then the people stuck on debt on the left saying, why is the system broken? And begging the government and getting angrier and angrier and angrier. The government gets the fake GDP to make it look like they're growing. The government takes on all of the debt, which means more dollars are created. You have something that looks closer and closer to, the government being bigger and bigger. So now I think in America it's about 30% of GDP. And then that is controlled by the corporations that sit on top, and they get all the benefit from that. And then you get this illusion of growth. And people get less and less productive, and that leads to the tensions that you're seeing right now. But essentially, both of the narratives of open borders and mass deportations, They're two sides of the same coin that taps into different narratives. And the goal is always, at the end of this, having seen this done in Germany, done in UK, done in various other parts of Europe, the end result is a surveillance state and more draconian law changes that take away and move you closer and closer and closer to, this full technocracy that we're getting closer to. Now, the American people that I speak to, they say, don't worry, I've got my First Amendment. I've got my freedom of speech. What's happening with that freedom of speech? We're talking on X, we're going on Spaces. We're feeding the algorithm, which is the data that's going to be used by Elon Musk and various others to create the social credit score that will be integrated with the stable coins. And so you can see how this is fed into it. We have no choice because we have to engage in artificial intelligence. And that's why I want everybody to be building their Bitcoin stack so that we can have decentralized money, decentralized artificial intelligence, decentralized data, identity. This is how we fight back. That's not going to be done through your First Amendment, because now it's going to be feeding the algorithm. Freedom of speech equals more data to be weaponized and put into organizations like Palantir, that in this big, beautiful bill is asking for all of that data to be consolidated into a private public corporation, where the share price is going through the roof and you are funding your own removal of your First Amendment. And then they say, well, no. If this gets too bad, I'm going to get guns, the Second Amendment. And so what will happen when you use your Second Amendment, you fight back and you resist against the system, that will be met by the technology that's been beta tested in Gaza. They will call you a terrorist by taking away those laws using the Patriot Act. If you resist, you protest, you debate. And so while you might be cheering all this along because you don't agree with some of the political views of some people protesting right now, next it's you. And those drones are starting to be used and beta tested in Ukraine. And so is it really extreme that the same technology, that the same corporations that don't give a shit about humans, that have created genocide as a service and occupation as a service, might use that same technology against you when you try to protest with your Second Amendment? And so this is what I believe is happening in California. And this is what was a launch pad when you recognize the pattern that they'll use against you. Essentially, what they're doing is they're bringing basically tech, these technology, military industrial complex, these various factions of the proof of weapons network. And they're using that same technology that they've been using in Gaza and Ukraine, and basically creating a privatized, even prison model, which is the American model. So if you are detained, those private corporations that can lobby, they get paid for every detainment. And then if you get deported, then they've got a new model that Trump set up with those countries that are vassalized into IMF loans, that are trying to free themselves with Bitcoin, but didn't accumulate enough Bitcoin, and so therefore had to take the IMF loan and therefore have to bow down to the proof of weapons network, like El Salvador. And so El Salvador has now created the privatized prison model using the same corporations that profit from every single detainee, and you end up with the same type of perverse incentives. And this is the type of thing that we're seeing right now, which is why, of all the countries in the world, the so-called beacon of freedom, the land of the free, has more people in prison, a higher rate of imprisonments than any country in the world. And a deep state that profits off raging wars around the world in order to control the resources to get drugs into the country, which is still done at state-sponsored level, despite the through this deep state partnerships between military, CIA, and the mafias and cartels that are in this, and so what are we seeing right now? Well, essentially, the violent colonial model that Europe, UK, US used in the Middle East, in Latin America, in the global South in general, in Asia regions that led to having these military bases all around the world, that very same model is turning inwards and being used by, because the government no longer works for you, because we've got these global institutions, is being used to destabilize the host countries. And you can profit from these currency trades, as I said, as you manipulate these different types of campaigns. This is exactly what we saw in UK and EU. This is why I left the UK. This is why Bitcoin gave me the economic freedom to be able to get outside of these psyops, so that I could give you the content, and hopefully you can do the same as well, if you keep those consistent good habits. Basically, the empire is cannibalizing on its own. And people in America, they criticize UK and EU, but we're seeing the same thing being done. So what comes next when you have these destabilization campaigns, this model that profits, you call in ICE. So ICE is basically told that they're enforcing immigration law to you, but there's nothing lawful about it. Just like the strikes that Israel was doing in Iran, there is nothing lawful about that. They're just going in. They call it a premeditated strike or something, or trying to get ahead of it, whatever the words or the legal jargon is. Anyway, basically, ICE is paid for every single arrest. They're also paid for every single deportation. It is a business model. Every single arrest equals a paycheck. Every single deportation equals a dividend. And so you can follow the money and you can understand why these models are happening. Basically, there is a privatized prison model. And so therefore, you want to scale that model. You scale that model by having more and more prisons and partnering with the companies that are addicted to your IMF dollar debt. And they're getting vassalized as you weaken the dollar, and they're trying to repatriate their assets. And so this global network makes sure that they're able to profit from it as well. These are basically prison cartels. What I want you to do is be aware of the corporations, so that when you're if you're a share investor and you're investing in index, maybe go out of those index and go into more individual corporations, and you can boycott the ones that you don't want to support. And so, there's companies like Geo Group that's involved in this, or Core Civic. And these are the types of companies. But anyway, this is what I think the end result is. Now, while we've got the first model in LA, I think it's a beta test, and you see more and more of these things. And I want you to recognize the pattern. As we transition to this world of AI that takes your jobs, CBDCs that end up programmable money with the privatized version through stablecoins, and this is why I want you to protect yourself with Bitcoin as much as you can. Essentially, you end up with the Magnificent Seven companies. That's the big tech companies, the Googles, the Apples, the ones that are building and benefiting from this AI structure, building the robotics and artificial intelligence. They're just essentially getting bigger and bigger and bigger and owning more and more control of the government, which is why there's this whole multipolar world order that we're switching to. They end up controlling the surveillance. The MIC, the military industrial complex, they basically control the enforcement and the deep state and the intelligence for all of the black op operations. They use foreign jurisdictions and militias like ISIS, Al Qaeda, Israel, and various other things in order to do the illegal stuff that you don't want to do at home. You wash it through USAID, and then the money comes back to the corporate contractors. And that's the model which is serving the interest of this greater state. When things get really crazy, like it is in Ukraine, you end up with the distressed debt and the distressed acquisitions of all of the key resources. And that's where BlackRock and Blackstone in the venture capital in the private side, They get to manage the transfer of the capital investments in order to do these types of operations, which are maximizing the value of their portfolio based upon their extreme power in the proof of weapons network. Now, what do you get at the end of it? You get a technocratic social credit score integrated into a stable coin. And what do you need in order to get there? You need a campaign that begs you to approve the bill that has all of the technology and the subsidies for that technology, which is one big, beautiful bill, which is currently being rushed through to print over $1 trillion that contains contracts to Palantir that's going to be taking all of the data that was essentially collected through Doge, that was collected through all these different health records, bank records, all of this different stuff. I covered all this last week in the Elon, Palantir, Epstein, Trump side, if you didn't watch that last week. And basically merge it all together, which is all included in the big, beautiful bill that is going to the next stage of approval. And Senate are going through it right now. They want to build the infrastructure for essentially the same occupation as a service that was used in the Middle East for their own people through these prison states and this technology. Everything is AI-powered raids in the future of this whole thing. You can have indefinite detentions. That's what's happening in El Salvador. Essentially, you go in there indefinitely. The family can't visit. Some of the claims is that this is not just being done on illegal criminal immigrants. This is being done on civilians as well, as some of the things that we're starting to see. And then that leads to massive fear and everybody begging to be protected from the unrest that comes from that as well. And I think this model is going to be scaled out, in essentially this regional power technocracy that America is becoming subordinate to the proof of weapons network. Algorithmic facial recognition and targeting, that's exactly what we saw in Gaza that was being used through different technologies. And the basically elimination of due process. That's exactly what we saw that led to the resistance in Gaza, when essentially Palestinians were all being detained with no due process because they just call them a terrorist. And once you call them a terrorist, there's no due process and you just end up in there. You see how this works. You see why they are manufacturing all these hate campaigns, racial campaigns, religious campaigns, spreading misinformation to manufacture rage so that you can opt into the same thing that is covered in this big, beautiful bill. This is basically real-time surveillance. And I think that LA is kind of Operation 1. And we shall see, and I'll keep tracking this in future episodes. But I think the next phase is not just deportations for illegal immigrants. I think you'll be targeting just poor people in general. It will be able to do ethnic cleansing, racial recognition through this technology. Protesters, you just call them, introduce new laws. You're being anti-Semitic, therefore you're a terrorist. You're a Hamas supporter. You're gone. And I think that they'll be doing it on citizens and non-citizens. I don't think it would just be the illegal immigrants. And this is ushering in the campaign because governments are subordinated to this power structure. And it's kind of a modern version, a neo version of slavery as homeland security. The final goal, as I said, is to make you beg for Palantir's technology and some of the BlackRock portfolio companies, the very same companies that people are buying that are going up in share prices as all of these things happen. Look at the prison companies, look at Palantir, look at the surveillance companies. They're going up in share price as things get more and more violent. And you'll be begging to restore order. And what do? They pay influencers. So you can see the coordinated influencers across X. People like Laura Loomer, that basically part of it. Their job is to say, right, manufacture all of the hate against Muslim people, the hate against anti-Semitism, and then use all of that in order to say, right, now we need to bring in Palantir. We need to use it on them. We need to deport more people, and they're using it on you. That's exactly what happened with the Patriot Act. That's exactly what Snowden revealed to us in his revelations. And that's exactly what documents were leaked through WikiLeaks when Julian Assange tried to do it. And that's why they ended up getting their freedom with Bitcoin so that they could fight against the system that was being weaponized against them. And I want you to follow the same model. And that's what I think we're seeing in the geopolitical side as well. I'll cover more of that when we get to part 3. But essentially their job, these influencers, is to make surveillance cool again. Create fear, push narratives. Then they'll tell you that you need this for safety, and then you can use it to crush dissent. Again, don't see this as me trying to say this is just about Trump. This is bipartisan. They want to distract you into thinking that changing the politician and changing the party is what happens, but that's the distraction as well. If Trump stops being profitable to the proof of weapons network, he gets to make money in loads of these deals. And if he's not making money for them and wrapping it up in a MAGA narrative to make you feel good about it, then he's expendable too. You can change it. It's a business model, and this is how it works. It's just like what we saw. ISIS is like a militia group, just like ISIS and Al Qaeda, which are used in order to create empire as a service and make you think that you're fighting against something when you're actually just being fooled by your own intelligence agencies and your own deep state. Anyway, this is how everything's kind of combining as we transition to this world of AI, Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies, stablecoins, the Bitcoin topic, the macro topic, the geo topic, the geopolitics topic. They're all coming together, and it's becoming more and more important. And so I will keep doing this every week to make sure this is the end of part 2. But I want to also leave you with solutions. Bitcoin is the resistance. By saving in Bitcoin rather than doing it in the proof of weapons network, you get to use proof of work, which is the resistance. And every dollar saved in Bitcoin is a dollar that doesn't support the Federal Reserve System. If you hold it in self-custody, you get to boycott the proof of weapons network rather than hold it with companies like BlackRock, which essentially is the CEO of the whole thing right now. Recognize that your First Amendment is probably going to be used to build your social credit score. And then your Second Amendment, if you fall for it, will be used to put you in jail and end up with some of these deportations for profit types of things. They're saying it's illegal immigrants so that they can later get the legal precedent that's needed by manufacturing it and then using it against you. That's why I want you to build as much sovereignty. I had someone in the comment section that always lost because I always say sovereignty. Apparently it's sovereignty. So if you're the person that always has that comments, you'll be proud of me. Shout out to you. I do read the comments. Please put comments below if you're watching on YouTube. We're going to be going through this together, as I said. And this is why it's important to not just think these things that are happening around the world, they got nothing to do with me. It's all connected now. It's a global world. And the same things that you tolerate happening to them may be happening to you. And I'll always make sure that you're following the money and looking at that. So that's the macro picture that we are experiencing right now. And so far in part 1, we covered everything that happened this week in Bitcoin. In part 2, we did everything that happened this week in macro and how that ties into the US and LA civil unrest campaigns. We've now got part 3. And in part 3, I'm going to be going through this week in geopolitics. And I want to follow the money. And then I'll tell you what I think I got wrong and what I think I got right in terms of my forecasts, what happened in the Israel strikes on Iran that are happening right now. So things may have changed while I'm going live. That's how fast things are moving. But I'm going to be covering all of that in part 3. It is completely different to, I believe, how it is being portrayed to you. And I want to make sure that you understand it, because now you know the techniques that are being used in these wars that you don't think affect you are now being used and weaponized against you. So understand the tactics so you can recognize it when it happens to you. Okay. A quick break. I'm going to have a little bit of water. What I'd love for you to do is help me get to 100K subscribers. If you enjoy this content, please share it. If you're watching the live, we'll break this up into 3 videos. You can share the relevant video that you'd like to share with your friends, with your family. You can put the comments below, or you can watch the whole thing. And this live recording will be on my YouTube channel. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers. We are very close, and then YouTube will review it. If after that review, I end up getting censored or taken down for any reason, I'll be on Rumble. So follow me on Rumble as a backup. If Rumble takes us down, I've also got it all backed up on simondixon.com. Join the free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Get yourself a login. I've got all sorts of additional goodies for you. And it will also mean that you join my newsletter so I can keep you up to date with everything as it happens. So that is everything for this week in macro in part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 85, US Destabilization Campaign. And in part 3, we're going to be covering the Iran escalations and the essentially the campaign that we're seeing right now that I believe we could frame as a regime change. So do that right now. I'm just going to take a bit of water and we'll jump straight into part 3. Welcome back to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 85, part 3, where we've already covered this week in Bitcoin and everything that's happening on the stablecoin side and the Bitcoin strategic reserves and how to protect yourself. In part 2, we covered everything that's happened this week in macro and the LA destabilization campaigns by following the money so you can protect yourself and don't get caught up in narratives and what they want you to believe. Now, in part 3, we're going to be doing this week in geopolitics. And right now, as we speak, things could have been changed as I'm live. There is Israel strikes within Iran, and I want you to understand what's happening, and I'll give you my interpretation of exactly what is happening here and why it is so important for you to follow it as well. Even if you think this is happening outside of your country, remember, many people are fearful of the impact in their country, oil prices, inflation, everything we covered in the macro section. But right now, as this campaign is happening, I've been up for over 24 hours doing live coverage on X Spaces as the strikes were happening and adjusting what I think was happening based upon the live events. And so I believe that I've got a clear picture of what is happening right now and what these strikes actually mean. And I'll share that with you right now. And we can adjust as we see more and more of this happening each and every week. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you in previous episodes what I got right. And what I got right is I said that there would be no war between Iran and US. I believe I'm still sticking to that prediction, that this is actually being done only via proxy, that Israel is doing everything right now. And it is because I believe that there has been agreement from Iran and the other power brokers in the region, which I'll break down, in order to allow this to happen without pushback. We saw that in Syria. We saw that in Lebanon. And we see that there are these different moments where everything just happens so seamlessly. And I think this is one of those moments because it is allowed to happen. And that's why I want you to see through this. But one of the things I said is that US won't go to war with Iran. I still hold by that. One of the things that I got wrong, semi-wrong, but wrong, so I have to put my hands up here. Yesterday, and prior to this in Bitcoin Hard Talk, I didn't believe that there was going to be strikes from Israel within Iran because I believed that we were moving towards normalization, but I didn't know how the plan was going to be executed. I said that there would need to be, if you go back to previous episodes, I said that we're moving towards normalization in the region due to a change in power structure, due to a partnership between the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and BRICS, and the power structure with America now that we've gone into tariffs and we're moving to this multipolar world order. I've covered that many times if you haven't watched previous videos. But based upon that, I thought that we were moving towards a negotiation and the strikes weren't necessary. But I did believe that there was going to be a regime change on both sides within Iran and Israel in order to get there. I now understand how they're going to do that. And that is what I think the strikes, and we saw significant strikes that I didn't predict that happened as I was covering this live on X Spaces. Make sure you follow me on X if you want to be up to date with these things and also interact with me and ask me questions as well. But there is significant strikes. I thought it was going to be, and I said on my tweet, I'll read exactly what I said before the event as well, so we can basically what's unfolded over the last. So before the strikes actually happened, this is what I said that I got half wrong and half right. I said, this is all theater. There will be no war between the US and Iran. Israel has stated it will strike Iran, and Iran's defense minister warns if war breaks out, every US base in the region will be targeted. And so that's where Iran, through its proxies, has targets and missiles on the US bases that are occupying Syria and Iraq illegally. And then in response, basically, I was reporting that US opens up voluntary evacuation for military families across the Middle East. I was also reporting in the same tweet that oil spikes 5% because it increased based upon these rumors. And I said, in my opinion, negotiations are moving forward. The drama is for you. And so I believe that they were creating strategic drama in order to put you in a state of frenzy before they announce the actual negotiations. But I also said at the end of the tweet, the same tweet, any strikes that do happen are for show to facilitate negotiations. Okay. So that bit is what I do believe I got right, but I never imagined they would be this strong, and I didn't predict the strategy. But now there are absolute major strikes. And these strikes is, as I was covering it live, and you can see the recording, I was saying to people, I believe that this is the separation between the new, basically the Reform Party within Iran, that if you remember, and when I covered it previously, there was a helicopter that went down. Raisi, the previous prime minister of Iran, he was assassinated. I believe that may have been Palantir type of technology operation. Maybe that happens to your Teslas in the future. Just saying. Electric vehicles. Just saying. Maybe it's, that's what the exploding pages were, your own devices. Just saying. I know that they use this on other people. So is it too extreme to think the same technology as we move to this type of thing? Don't want to, just saying. But I think they basically were assassinating anybody that was part of the IRGC. The IRGC was the group that formed from the revolution. And so they have a two-tiered system where you have Khamenei, that is in charge on the theocratic part of it, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps underneath, which is the army part. And then you have the political division, where we had regime change when that helicopter went down. And from that moment, the new prime minister was the one that ushered in operations like allowing the Pages attack to happen to Hezbollah in Lebanon, allowing the strategic retreat and the overthrow of Assad in Syria based upon what I believe was agreement between Russia, US, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and Iran, because they had been moving towards normalization, and therefore that required some kind of regime change. And I think that's what we're witnessing right now. So anybody that was going to be problematic to this normalization process is currently being assassinated. Completely illegal. US knows about the operation. Israel is executing it. But if this was real, there would be massive pushback because Iran does have the military and capabilities to do what happened in the previous operations. Just like if anyone attacks Israel, Israel will take the Iron Dome, and they will take those and they will fight back against it before it happens. And in previous episodes and dramas between Iran and Israel, which is essentially, I believe, an Operation Gladio, where you have strategic tension, where military companies make trillions of dollars profits by always manipulating media narratives that Iran is trying to expand, and Iran is about to have a nuclear and take over the region, and Iran is about to kill all of the Jews and take over Israel and expand. Those narratives justify all of the military profits, and you have Israel is defending itself, where you can steal money from the American people, the European people, the British people, print that money, send it over to military, and then that is spent back into the military contractors. All you need is strategic tension, and Operation Gladio shared how the CIA, how MI6 and Mossad do this. And when you read Covert Regime Changes and various other things, these are the exact type of operations they do outside. And I believe that this is that type of operation, which has now come to an end because of the power of Saudi Arabia and the GCC. I'll go through that anyway. I've covered it in previous broadcasts, but I'll tie it into the events. So what happened anyway? What is happening right now, and what happened over the last 24 hours? Sorry if my voice is going. I have not stopped, and I'm suffering from a severe lack of sleep, but it is such a changing moment, and I'm feeling a range of emotions as, you know, these are not things that anything I say doesn't change anything. I just want you to understand it so you can get ahead of it. This is not what I want to happen. All I'm trying to report is what I believe is happening by following the money and using game theory and my understanding of markets in order to try and project forward what I think happens. It doesn't always work right, but in general, I believe I've got this right in terms of direction. I just didn't predict that we would get it done in this way. But anyway, here's how it happened. So the press starts to leak lots and lots of rumors that Israel is about to do strikes on Iran. That all came, if you go back to following the sources, it all came from Israel that was leaking to media. And we know that media is funded by the same types of deep state operations and controlled by those that are part of this proof of weapons network as well. We came out with the narrative from Trump as well. He's doing his usual truth social post. Trump said that the US personnel in the Middle East are being moved out because it could be a dangerous place. He said in his tweets, we will see what happens. We will see what happens. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. We won't allow it. And you had all of those different narratives. Sorry, my Trump accent is so bad. I love those videos. Have you seen that the China guy that does the best Trump impression? You probably see it when you're watching some of my videos, and it goes into some of the others. I need to work on my impressions anyway. We won't allow it. So you got all of this ratcheting up of narratives. And as I said, I thought this was strategic pressure to lead to the negotiation deal, and then that would lead to regime change. But no, we're getting the regime change up front, and then I believe that it will lead to, you know, the negotiations and the deal with the parties. And I'll share in this section what I think happens next, and we can analyze it in real time as it happens. And I don't know what is happening right now, so sorry if everything has changed it. But right now, when I left off, there is massive strikes across, and Iran is letting them all happen. They're saying they're going to retaliate. You're getting all of that, but they're not stopping them. To me, that's exactly what we saw in Syria, which means this is allowed to happen. And I was right that this is for show, but I didn't realize it would be just this type of operation. So the IAEA, which is essentially where you have all the inspections, the nuclear inspections, there was lots of leaks from a so-called cyber attack by Iran saying that Israel has been controlling that entity. You know, the inspections have been used for a US agenda. Essentially, when you say US, it's a proxy for military industrial complex and banks, because that's the host state for these power structures. And then you have intelligence underneath that. So the IAEA came out and declared that Iran is not compliant with its nuclear safeguard obligations. This is essentially, immediately you had the US, the UK, and France. They came out immediately, and Germany. They accused Iran of not being in compliance with essentially the 2015 JCPOA agreement, which was the nuclear deal agreement that Obama negotiated, that Trump tore up, and the US reneged on, and then blamed it on Iran. So it's complete gaslighting. You can understand these things. I mean, if you know Iran's history, they were subject to CIA overthrow, colored revolutions. The British Empire and the American Empire wanted to use Iran's oil. When they tried to nationalize it, they said, no, you're not doing that. We overthrow your government. And then they created British Petroleum. And then eventually the Ayatollah, which was living in France at the time, was put. Then we have the Iranian Revolution. And then suddenly we get trillions and trillions of dollars of profits for the military industrial complex based upon this multi-decade fear of, are the nuclear deals about to happen? Are they enriching when they're enriching nuclear energy? And this forever that leads to more and more justification of why you spend money on military contractors. Well, anyway, that deal that was ripped up in 2015, which was meant to be the solution, Iran doesn't have sanctions. They follow weapons inspection. Trump rips it up. And now suddenly they're saying you're in violation of that deal. And it was Donald Trump that abandoned it in his last administration. It was shredded very publicly in 2018. And all countries refuse to essentially abide by it. But they control the media narrative to make you think that Iran is this crazy person that's about to blow up the whole region, expand the region, and implement Sharia law across the whole thing. Narrative control. But doesn't mean that at the top they're not involved as well. This is the problem with these operations. There's corruption at the government level, but you just need to be able to recognize the patterns. It doesn't mean that the people aren't genuinely rebelling like they were in Syria, but they're connected to these deep state operations. And then you don't know who you're working for. And then suddenly you're working for just like Americans that thought they were working in protecting their country after 9/11, realized that they were just essentially killing Ukrainians. Sorry, not killing Ukrainians, and that's more recent, but killing Iraqis, civilian casualties. And then we found out that there were these groups like ISIS that were created, and WikiLeaks has all of these documents. Look up the Hillary Clinton email leaks, put in ISIS in WikiLeaks. You can find all of these different documents and operations as well. We know how it works. When you see the Islamist jihadi terrorists, like they're starting to push this week with Al-Qaeda saying he's going to, Al-Qaeda was coming out saying we're going to kill, we're going to do assassinations on Trump, Elon Musk, and J.D. Vance. You know that these are videos from groups that are created from operations like Al-Qaeda, which are CIA operations and Mossad operations to manufacture these types of fear. Anyway, we saw all of that this week. You see it all. Once you see the patterns, you'll recognize it. That's why you should follow me in X. I keep sharing it with you in real time. But anyway, we had the announcement that there was basically a series of strikes. This was happening in real time while I was on the X Spaces. They're probably still going live right now. Been on for over 24 hours. They were taking out basically announcement after announcement of key IRGC, leadership, military personnel, key people within the IRGC, and they were going, but there was no pushback. We're led to believe that Iran, who is completely capable of defending against these things, they just allow it to happen. That's an inside job. And so it immediately led to like a blackout, or the internet going down and all sorts of stuff. And then you get the people, Netanyahu coming out, America coming out and inciting the people to, because there was a sanction campaign, those that are economically in a very bad position, just like happened in the British operations, where those that were shut down during COVID and recently took to the streets based upon believing these different narratives. They're trying to create a colored revolution to have an overthrow of the leadership and incite violence and have a colored revolution, just like is happening in LA right now. Watch what's happening there, because it's being used on yourself as well. I covered that in the part 2 this week in macro. In case you're only watching this video, you might want to go back to that. So Israel basically has now, at the time, during this, and sorry, I'm a bit sleep deprived. There's way more details, but I can't remember everything. 20 Iranian generals have been assassinated. There was an attack on nuclear and military facilities, and I think it's getting harder and harder and harder. And it is all being allowed to happen, but no oil or, different types of infrastructure, is being targeted as well. So it doesn't impact the price of oil too aggressively. I believe personally, from following the money and recognizing that Iran has everything they need if they wanted to defend themselves, Iran is allowing every single strike to happen. And there is basically is happening with no defense. Israel is at the moment right now violated the Iraqi airspace as well. So this was allowed to happen from Iraq, and that is only allowed to happen if there is commands from those that Iran funds in Iraq that they're allowed to happen at the highest level. That's what I personally believe as well. This is all done, what's happening in Iraq. They're launching from there under US protection, under US bases that ordinarily, if this wasn't engineered, Iran would have fired towards in this type of escalation if they were actually defending themselves, if this was not manufactured and orchestrated. We also had Hezbollah in Lebanon. They said that they came out and said that we will not initiate attacks on Israel in response to the strikes in Iran. That means that if the resistance is not being told and there is no defense in Iran, this is being allowed to happen. And this is part of what I said, the optics in order to move to the next phase. I just didn't know it would happen this extreme, and it would be combined with what I think we're witnessing right now, with all of those that are being taken out. I have a lot of mixed emotions about this. I'm just sticking to following the money. I'm not talking as if from the humanitarian perspective. I understand different people who have different emotions. I'm trying to stick to what I believe is happening from the analysis side. I'm ignoring what I think is happening in Gaza right now from the humanitarian side. But I do believe that despite the fact that there is still the starvation campaign happening there, this does lead to something which I'd like to share what happens next anyway. So Israel basically launched the planes from Syria. So Syria was required. So you recognize the sequence of events that was required in order to do this operation. And that's why I believe, because Iran allowed these different operations to happen within Lebanon with Hezbollah, and the regime change to happen within Assad in Syria, and that led to this operation where there is no pushback. The attacks are coordinated. They are pre-approved by all of the relevant parties. I believe that they are approved from basically the new prime minister of Iran, which sorry if I get the name right, Pezeshkian. Sorry, I've got that completely wrong. Pezeshkian. I butcher these names. I'm really, really bad at it. But essentially, this is, I believe, the negotiations that was really happening over multiple periods in order to usher in this multipolar world order. And it was negotiations between the Proof of Weapons Network that had historically used Israel as a proxy and Netanyahu as a proxy to fund forever wars to destabilize the region. But now the financial faction of the Proof of Weapons Network, i.e. the banks represented by Trump and various other parts, they're now going to be investing in the region, which is why we saw all these public deals. And the Middle East is going to be used to host these data centers, artificial intelligence, And basically, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, is a trusted broker between BRICS, headed up by China, with Russia and Iran joining, and Egypt joining. BRICS is partnering with the GCC. And on the other side, you've got the American, the European, the Proof of Weapons Network, headed up by BlackRock right now, but that power structure can change. I think the head of Saudi Arabia ended up in the board of Saudi Aramco in order to use its influence to negotiate an alternative to the military-industrial complex, which is what we're seeing right now. And so in these negotiations, I believe, was the GCC, Iran, Israel, US, and I believe we're seeing the execution of that strategy, with all parties having to agree that this is where we're moving. But you need to use some geopolitical theater, and it's absolutely necessary in order to usher in this way. Very few people will be watching my videos relative to how many people will be involved in this. But essentially, by doing it via this type of engineered, orchestrated reactions that are agreed by all people, which is what we saw between Iran and Israel in the last two retaliations over the last year or so, you basically get to do a soft landing. I've been following Evan X's work from the work on the game theory through Middle Nation as well. And I think put together, this type of geopolitical game theory that is combined with some of my financial monetary flows and other work in order to put together, these type of analysis as well, which I think hopefully following the money helps you understand that these things, I said we're moving to normalization, and I think this is further evidence of it. But the strategy by which they executed, I didn't predict. I just thought it would be small strikes as well. Anyway, this allows for essentially huge changes over multi-decade policies, and is kind of a way of transforming regions. 30-year nuclear Operation Gladio, back and forth between Iran, Israel, narratives with US, the whole fake war and terror, everything that happened between the radicalization of, Americans after 9/11, the radicalization of Jewish people through Zionism to join the IDF to engage in ethnic cleansing, the radicalization through joining these Western-funded groups through USAID like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and having these CIA ops. Basically, this is a way to signal to everybody that there is a major change, and there is a narrative towards peace and prosperity, and signal to these different groups that this is what's happening that sets the world order to right now. So you need these kind of theater to manage these transitions. It basically appeals to the different factions of the public, whether it's the American audience, the Western audience, whether it's the different factions of the Iran audience, those that support resistance, those that are part of covert militias for Western intelligence like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and the general public and all these different factions. It basically sets the stage for what I believe the next phase is right now, which is the US, GCC, Proof of Weapons Network, Iran, Turkey, and the negotiation that the entire region set in order to hand over power, because now the GCC has money to be able to decolonize, and America can strategically, rather than having its proxies like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Israel, they can stop being used as violence and neo-colonialism that it has been used over the decade. And now, by buying their way out of it, I think the GCC has managed to set a new game that involves new investments and needs the changes that we're witnessing right now in order to usher in the next wave of prosperity And those that were part of it, it's either the ones that need to go, the ones that are part of it, the ones that are negotiating. And I don't know what else to say other than that. That's what we're seeing right now. I believe that Iran has been on the path to normalization for a long, long time. It was brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It has been going on for years right now. And the cost of this normalization, I believe, from Iran's perspective, is to abandon its proxies, enter into games that set the tone, and then end up with the result of those games, the things that are being negotiated, and then the abandonment of the axes to integrate into a different mission. Basically, that is what I think we're seeing right now. And it is being led by the Iranian regime changed government, the reformist parties. And it involves the regime change that I think we're watching with the assassinations right now. And Trump is saying there is more to follow. And then after that, we can return to negotiations. And those negotiations will be with those that have already been negotiating. And this is just the public enactment of this changing moment that I've been sharing on previous episodes in the geopolitical section, but now is actually being enacted. I believe this all emerged as a result of BRICS basically converging with the GCC, everything that happened in Iran with Russia, and the fact that US now needs to focus on its AI robotics, become a regional power, and the fact that it is now subordinate to BlackRock, and BlackRock is investing in BRICS and doing everything that I said in the macro section in terms of reallocation of capital, currency manipulation, the whole proof of weapons network and the different factions, including military, technology, financial, consumption, pharma, have all been portfolio managed into this capital reallocation that I covered in part 2. And so as a result of that, we're seeing this regional convergence that is being executed right now, and slowly over time, a complete shift from the last 100 years since the British colonization, the French colonization, and the Neo-American colonization that is being decolonized right now, is as a consequence of Iran basically conceding based upon what it is agreed. It is now moving towards cooperation with the region. It was brokered by China through the normalization. Trump gets to take credit for it because he can probably say, I've got Abraham Accords too. He probably gets his Nobel Peace Prize, as I've covered in various other things, even though it was BRICS that made this happen. But public optics will never allow that story to be told. And also Israel gets to look good. America gets to look good. And everybody gets to look good so that they can tell the story in the way that they need to rewrite history. But we will continue to document when you follow money. Anyway. It was basically negotiate with the US to eliminate control in the region and hand it over to those that control the investments and everything in the region, which is the GCC. GCC said we can't normalize with Israel until the violence stops, which means we have to have a Palestinian self-determination. To have Palestinian self-determination, Iran needs to give up the resistance. Iran has moved towards that. The people that aren't on board with that are being eliminated. And now Iran is working with China and Russia and the BRICS corridor, and the GCC and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar are the brokers between, because they have certain military bases, and now they are going to have self-determination. And any of the vassalized states, rather than being governed by external forces for the dollar's interest, will now be governed for regional interest, which has no interest in war once you've got through the previous legacy issues. And because US has handed over that power and they sit between BRICS and the US, this is why I think it's all happening. And it required the resistance alongside the normalization, alongside Egypt and Jordan, which wouldn't allow for the ethnic cleansing, and the failed Netanyahu mission that now led to the real economic destruction of Israel, the exposure of the Zionist project around the world that led to all the protests and all of the everything that we've been covering, that all collectively come together into this pragmatic moment where it's no longer going to be solved by violence. And the tragedy of this is the starvation campaign and the unbearable humanitarian violence and the genocide that we're witnessing within Palestine. Until the deal is done, they're negotiating with that. This is the execution. Once the execution is done, I believe we move to the next phases. And that is what I think we're witnessing right now. So Iran has essentially, I believed, as this operation, reduced some of its decision-making autonomy in exchange for normalization and regime survival, and whatever that looks like. I personally believe that Khamenei has approved this. I know people will find that very offensive. I know people won't want to believe that. I just think that's what's happening. Or he needs to go as part of a colored revolution exercise that may be happening as we speak. I don't know, because this is happening in real time. And as it unfolds, I think I know the general direction, but the full details of exactly how it's happened is not going to be fully known, but I can try and get the gist here. I believe that he is managing his the Islamic Republic of Iran's basically that base. So he needs to push narratives into media that are going to make you think that there is going to be a massive retaliation. And I don't think there is going to be a massive retaliation. This is him essentially moving towards exit. And this is pragmatic because all of the fighting has only led to more death, more destruction. And now there is time to move on. And so this is being managed through the theater at the moment, I think. But it is essentially, rather than maybe a regime change, it's a regime handover, depending on the fate of what comes next that we haven't actually seen right now. The proof of weapons network has basically the financial side of the proof of weapons network has replaced the military industrial complex, which profited from the destabilization campaigns and the forever wars within the region that required Israel, that required Zionism as a narrative, that required plausible deniability of the US. And the US was a proxy for the proof of weapons network and the deep state that controls and is able to use US dollars to prop it up, as I covered in the macro section as well. And so this, I believe, is the handing over from the military industrial complex side of the proof of weapons network over to the asset management and the financial side, which is going to be working with GCC, investing in the region and doing deals that Trump is a proxy to negotiate for the big tech companies and all the deals that were being done on the, I covered a whole video on that where I analyzed Trump's speech in Saudi. If you want to go back to some of those as well on the channel. Basically, Iran is undergoing the same kind of internal change. Rather than the internal military industrial complex within Iran, is moving over to financial, and that requires sanction being removed. Sanction being removed means that you can deliver more economic prosperity to your people. And the only way to achieve that without the sanctions and the colored revolution campaigns that were tried to happen, they need to transition from just spending on military to regional diplomacy. And this is a way of delivering that in an acceptable way that either leads to a colored revolution, if that's the plan, or allows them to usher this in without the colored revolution. And so I think we're witnessing a divergence between essentially the state of Iran. I said that like an American. Of Iran. You can tell I've been up for a while. And essentially the Axis and the proxy side, the IRGC side, and those that are going to be normalizing and ushering in this change. It's a slowly winding, unwinding through either expulsion or diplomacy, various constituents of the Axis, the IRGC, and that's what we've been seeing time and time again over the months. In fact, I think this has been happening since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020 under the Trump administration, who was fighting against ISIS. And they did retaliate, but they didn't retaliate it was almost escalate to de-escalate, that type of operation. And we've seen this operation quite a few times as these normalization negotiations have happened. It's basically theater strikes today, is the execution of the plan, and there will probably be a retaliation by Iran, but it will be either an equal type of thing, but probably significantly less. And the design is to show that they did retaliate, but this is all theatrics, as I said from here. Everybody's involved in knowing what comes next. I believe that they're important in executing this mission, which is all of the regional powers, including Russia, that still has a role in certain parts, and China and BRICS and GCC and all of the middle people, as well as US and various other parts of the proof of weapons network and the corporations as well. It's basically rallying kind of the hardliners, the different types of proxies, and everything that needs to happen in order to send a signal to everybody and the parties that this is the agreement that is happening, the terms are going to be upheld, and the resistance is ready to be scaled back in terms of its advances. This is a prerequisite in terms of until it can move to sanctions relief, the next phase, and then basically trade integration around the relative powers and all the power games that have been played and negotiated through this violent episodes that are happening. And everything is pre-approved, as I said. I think we're at the end of the negotiations. And maybe there are games that happen in between based upon different power dynamics and deviations from those agreements. But this is negotiations that are moving in the general direction. And this is a pivot towards normalization. I think that's what we're seeing. This is an alternative to internal collapse. The power dynamics of internal collapse meant Iran would have to fight back harder. Iran fighting back harder means that BRICS would end up in a situation where it has to protect its strategic assets, which would then lead to direct US conflict. That would lead to World War III, and no one would win World War III. And so this was, out of all the games, this is the end negotiation. And the theater basically buys the time to do the integration, slowly transition into this regional plan without admitting defeat by any parties that need to admit defeat, and everyone gets to say, we won, is essentially why this has to happen in this way, I think. It's a resourceful way of managing the transition. And I think in the end, it is a way of managing the proxies, managing the nuclear rhetoric, and basically the proxies and the nuclear at this stage ended up being liabilities for the proof of weapons network, just as Zionism and religious fueling of narratives for Israel has also become a liability because the brand has been so damaged, and so military no longer has those key assets, and so it goes to the redevelopment stage and the financial side of the proof of weapons network. They're too costly, they're isolating, and essentially it was just leading to more military industrial complex strikes. They're getting their last bits of profit to replenish with those military companies. And that's what I think. This is the execution of this. This theater leads to basically an exit, a pragmatic way, just based upon the power and everything we're seeing right now. It keeps certain parts of the regime intact, and the parts that aren't meant to be intact disappear. I believe Netanyahu needs to have his exit as well. This achieves that. He's basically trying to say and deliver to his people, as disgusting as it is, listening to his speeches, knowing what he's done for the military companies that I believe he works for, and is now trying to protect his own career because of all the corruption, bribery, and everything that follows. He needs to deliver back a win to his people, and he gets to say, I took away the nuclear threat of Iran, and I took it out with my strikes, even though it was allowed to happen, and the real war never actually happened. It's just straight through, just like what happened in Syria. In reality, Netanyahu knows that the cabinet is completely destroyed. Israel is economically destroyed. The coalition won't stand up. There are extremist elements that is leading to these settler colonial expansions. The violence has to come to an end. So I think there will be regime change based upon delivering this and giving everyone their exit. And the ratcheting up of narratives that we'll keep watching on BitcoinHardTalk. But basically, Netanyahu is using these strikes and this stage and these in order to take out the people and say, I have neutralized Iran's attack. He gets all the narratives that he needs. And basically, this allows him to get whatever his negotiated exit as well that's been happening. It delivers all of the optics without basically risking absolute chaos. And chaos in the region just leads to more death, more destruction, more profits for the proof of weapons network. And that stinky old neocon model is coming to an end. And all of the different factions within the Zionist part of the US Congress and Senate and various other things, they need their story to make it look like they got their victory. And this needs to be managed and the manage unwind from here. They get to say, we saved Israel from Iran's nuclear threat. You know, that narrative. America gets to think like, yes, Trump delivered what we need. The MAGA crew get their narrative. You know, they will never know what was happening with the brick side and the utility that actually delivered here. Because at the end of the day, it is a weakening of soft power from America, but they pragmatically, America as a country, handed over to the proof of weapons network that controls the government, which is why you're getting these types of campaigns and manufactured dissent, because the government no longer works for the people. You need to watch part 2 to understand that bit of the equation. But the cabinet in Israel is on life support. It requires the coalition to survive. They had votes just before this. It can only last so long. And so you get this whole ability to be able to exit and deliver those narratives. What else have we got for you as we set up towards the end as well? I do believe that there will be a cabinet collapse. That is the next phase that needs to happen. And there will be a cleanup around the radical parts of the ideology of Zionism that fueled all of these settler colonial expansions and the illegal settlements. Those will slowly go through negotiations with the new power brokers in the region, which is essentially the GCC in partnership with the Proof of Weapons Network, to be able to take those. I actually believe it probably ends up into some kind of one-state solution with an Arab majority over time, the purchasing of all of those assets, equality for anyone that wants to live on the land, exactly how it was before the British colonization, where Muslims and Christians and Jewish people could live in peace, and Jewish immigrants were welcome, but the colonizers weren't welcome. And then the colonizers weaponized this whole Zionism ideology to create all the war, death, and destruction, and the Operation Gladio, and the confiscation of resources, and the CIA operations, and everything that has happened decade after decade after decade. In reality, what I believe is happening right now is that the Israeli cabinet and the Iran's Islamic Republic are both basically headed towards the exit, a normalization, and Iran has essentially Iran 2.0. And Iran 2.0 is a different structure, a different force, and I think one that will be normalized into the entire region, as has already been discussed. The US, I believe, is enforcing its concessions on Israel because it is transitioning from military to financial. And the proof of weapons network and the GCC normalized via China and BRICS is basically putting its new regional power on Iran as well. And they're transitioning to financial deals. And that is what I think the transition that we're witnessing. And it will be a multiple period that we need to watch in order to see how this is going to work out. As I said, they've been negotiating for a while. And then after that, I think we enter into a denuclearization phase, demilitarization phase. It will probably look like whatever happens in the normalization between the end of kind of this Zionist type of ideology to fuel war and radicalism, and this whole Islamic Republic, and fueling the Islamic State. These things, I think, are no longer going to be used, and I think they simultaneously have to be negotiated. And this essentially marks the end of the military-industrial complex game. The Operation Gladio of the strategic tension between Iran and Israel that led to $7.5 trillion of profits that were stolen from the American people, that the American and British and Europeans paid through inflation, that led to that money being siphoned off to the corporate contractors that profit from war, rapage, pillaging, destruction, and the proof of weapons network and the violence that backs up the dollar, the pound, the euro. And this basically is the end of that phase. What do we think will happen next? Here's some of the things that I think will happen. Basically, I think that Iran I think we'll see. Just looking at my notes, coming towards the end of this session, I think we'll see a retaliation from Iran. It may have happened as I speak, but Israel will continue to strike, and there'll be no pushback against it. The operation will be allowed to happen by Iran. Iran may need to retaliate to show that there is some degree of retaliation. I think it will be to a lesser degree. It won't lead to any of the assassinations and violence unless that is part of the counter strategy. I'm not sure. We'll see. I'll continue to analyze that as it happens. After that, I think escalation will cease. There'll be no war between Iran and US. Trump will continue his narrative that I warned them, I told them not to do the bomb and all that type of stuff. But that will be, I think, the end of it after the retaliation. No World War III. World War III has been prevented. This was the alternative to World War III. Most people think that Israel is trying to get US into war, and US is going to be forced into war, into World War III, because they believe that Israel controls America. I personally believe that Israel is an outlet for the military-industrial complex corporations, and both Israel and America are subordinate to those power structures. And Zionism is just a narrative, and that is fed out in order to have the lobby groups and various other control structures, and that I've covered in previous videos anyway. I believe that we'll get a state and proxy divergence between Iran and the IRGC, and the axes as well. These were some things that Evan X covered on X that I follow as well in this as well. I believe that Iran will be eliminating what's left of its axis IRGC narrative slowly, however that needs to happen. And then finally, I think after that, which I think is what we're witnessing, I think the genocide comes to an end at that stage. Hamas and Israel will suddenly and spontaneously reach a ceasefire deal and a ceasefire agreement. And I believe that will be the final stage of the US-Iran negotiations. So there will be the negotiations happening. Once those negotiations are settled, as evil as it is, this is why they're negotiating. You know, this is the US and Israel are essentially negotiating with a genocide. I know some people will want to say typical Iran, why are they allowing this to happen? Why don't you blame the people actually doing the genocide? And I know that Iran probably had corrupt elements that profited from this Operation Gladio. Is too complicated to see exactly who's who, but you get the plan. You can see it. You can recognize it. That then leads to Iran sanctions relief, which will stop any forms of colored revolutions or overthrow, because we will have the new government. That will essentially lead to an era like we're seeing in Syria, where now you can use your resources, people can move to prosperity. The campaign of using sanctions in order to create violence and destroy countries through covert operations and CIA operations, that comes to an end. The Israeli cabinet, I believe it will be removed. I'm not sure exactly how that happens, but I believe it does have to happen, and it will happen. And as part of the deal, I think it's the only way you can get to the next phase. Iran and Israel will be simultaneously essentially defunded by external proxies and denuclearized. Whatever the deal is for Iran will be the deal for the disclosure that Israel has to go through. And I think this is why they had the whole Iran leaking documents that disclose the illegal nukes that Israel has never disclosed. I think that's why that was released as part of this process. And you will have an announcement of an Iran normalization with Israel that involves the Palestinian self-determination. It will be executed by the GCC, and it will have the negotiations that Trump and the Proof of Weapons Network negotiated in order to allow for this decolonization process to happen. And this will essentially secure the region from no more proxy wars, no more fake ISIS, no more funding through USAID of Al-Qaeda, no more fake narrative. This is all about no more genocide, no more wars that are orchestrated. And that is because the US stopped funding it to prop up the dollar, because this whole AI and robotics world that we're transitioning to required everyone to avoid World War III, focus on energy, focus on artificial intelligence, focus on America as a regional power in a technocracy where cloud-based data centers is what commands control rather than state and borders. Sovereign nations like the GCC, some of the GCC nations, multipolar regional structures, and the GCC being a power broker between BRICS and the Western powers that are controlled by this Proof of Weapons Network with BlackRock as CEO. And then I do believe that we will see a Palestine emerging. Basically, there was plans out there. There was an Egypt plan, a $53 billion rebuild. Those contracts would be negotiation. There was a plan that was put forward if America and Israel would ever allow by the military industrial complex to allow for Palestinian self-determination. That plan was already published. It's called the Palestine Emerging Initiative. You can look it up on AI or in Google. And it will be enforced by the GCC, Egypt, Jordan, and these regions will get their investments. Slowly, the GCC will pay down, as it is for Syria, World Bank debt, IMF debt, which are vehicles for control and colonization. These will slowly be decolonized. Any settler colonial land, I think it will be purchased into some kind of one-state solution once this, essentially, the external forces, the ratcheted up the narratives and radicalization, they go. And essentially the proof of weapons elites that, like Trump, get to invest in some of the deals and put up his Trump towers in the regions where it was agreed as part of the exit negotiations. And Gaza essentially gets to do what Singapore did, which it started as a vassalized state, Singapore, decolonized by its Portuguese, British occupiers. And then it was allowed by actually having investments by neighbors rather than, external colonizers. They were allowed to build up their investments. They were allowed to usher in an environment where they can rebuild their systems. Maybe they can build Bitcoin standards, all sorts of interesting things that can be rebuilt in this rebuild phase. And I think it will be the beginning of the liberation of Gaza based upon this model. And I think it's because how did this actually happen? There were models of resistance. And in the end of the day, the only way to decolonize with Western colonizers is to buy your freedom. And so after war, after war, after war, the GCC state actors needed to partner with the West. And then because they didn't have a debt-based Ponzi scheme, they built up sovereign wealth through utilizing their resources rather than handing it over to private banks and central powers. The proof of weapons network turned on the West, vassalized the government, used lobby power, used securitization and financialization to create a stateless power proof of weapons network that used the deep state and took over the government and is able to utilize those governments for their own interest and print money through central banks, where banks are the shareholders. And so those corporations are in charge of all the West, and they're now doing destabilization campaigns and using the same colonization techniques that they used on the global South, the Middle East, and Asia and Latin America. They're using it on their own people right now. And so what is the lesson? It's only through economic sovereignty that these regions were able to put themselves in a position of power, which is the lesson that we have to learn here. There is resistance, which serves its purpose, but resistance in the West comes from being economically powerful. How do you become economically powerful? You beat the proof of weapons network. How do you beat the proof of weapons network? You use peaceful proof of work that beats every asset and the inflation that it creates. You hold it in self-custody so you don't support the power of the proof of weapons network. You stop borrowing. You pay down debt if you can over time by saving in Bitcoin in self-custody, and you spend local by having more control over your money rather than handing it over to asset managers. And you exit the debt-based system and you support countries and your local communities that are building Bitcoin financial services built upon hard sound money, gold, without having the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And that is the lesson. That is the lesson that applies to us. It applies to businesses. It applies to sovereigns. And that is what the Middle East taught us. They could only decolonize when they were economically powerful enough in order to be in a position to negotiate with their colonizers. That's the only time they listened. So you need to build your economic power. And you do that by owning more Bitcoin this month, more than the previous month. We're moving to a world of AI, central bank digital currencies, and Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the resistance because it's built upon a proof of work network that allows you to own it through this decentralized distributed supercomputer where no one controls the network. And we need to take that message and that network and apply it to artificial intelligence. So we get decentralized AI and we get decentralized identity now that we've got decentralized money. And we recognize that there is a centralizing power structure. And the only way to fight against it is to be economically powerful enough to lobby, because they don't listen to you. They work for those that pay their paychecks. That's what politicians do in the West. Unless you work for a country that has their own sovereign wealth, essentially, that is able to use the resources rather than being vassalized. And so don't wait for them to do it. Don't wait for your government. You do it for yourself. Don't engage in the things that I talked about in part one, people launching public companies to come between you and Bitcoin. Don't borrow against your Bitcoin so that you can be margin called and lose your Bitcoin. Don't end up using all of these tools of the next wave of banks and financial institutions that are getting into these services. Own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Do it in self-custody. Spend local. And let's rebuild this decentralized system. Invest, work, or build. And invest in these decentralized systems that we need to build as we manage this transition to a world of Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies. CBDCs want your freedom. It will be programmatic money. You need as much out of that. AI will take your job. You need to lean into that. Understand how you can become more productive. There is nothing stopping that train. And so you need to build as much fiat currency, save in Bitcoin, exit the system, build economic power, get to work from this week, listen to your family, sit down with your family. The world is changing. There's no doubt that artificial intelligence is going to change everything from here, and robotics. And you need to prepare for that. And you've got years to do that. I'll keep covering this because always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do well. And I want you to be on the right side of this change. We can do it with peace, love, and unity. And it's got dark that my lighting has actually gone done. Maybe I can handle some better lighting. There we go. That's nicer. And so for this outro, I'll be over on X covering, finding out what's happened live, whether I got it wrong or whether I got it right. But let's do this with peace. That's going to do it for Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 85. Bitcoin stabilization, US destabilization campaign, and Iran regime change. Peace.